What began as a simple project to port the Stanley Parable to consoles quickly spiraled into a content expansion deserving of the name Ultra Deluxe. This time around, the Stanley Parable has been molded and reshaped to better suit the ongoing modern-day trends of the video game industry. And just like modern-day video game trends, it's not just a re-release, it's a sequel.
This is the story of a man named Stanley. Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427. Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard.
The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is a recreation of a 2011 Half-Life 2 mod written by Davey Wreden and developed by William Pugh. First recreated as a full standalone release on the Source engine in 2013, and then later recreated within Unity to further expand upon its content and reach broader markets. This is a game that has a lot of history.
Okay, I'm over it now. What do you think? Are you sick of this gag yet?
History that covers Easter eggs, inside jokes, battles of depression, what the true meaning of media is, and what is actually happening when someone interprets meaning from media. It's difficult at times to believe that people who you can only observe are even people at all. People who are able to pursue their dreams, are wildly successful, and carry a prominent image online are reduced down to metaphorical artwork or propaganda, depending on your view of things. It's easy to interpret people who you can never truly realize as humans as statues, which, just like video games, you can interpret a million different meanings out of. You can rerun the critical lens over games like the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide a million times to come to a million conclusions, but the takeaways for developers and players are going to vary dramatically. Wreden has understood this since the very beginning while working on the 2011 mod. The mod comes with developer commentary that expresses players' experiences are often dependent on the order in which they play the endings. As an extension, player experiences will also be dependent on the information and other media in which they have consumed. The Beginner's Guide, a game also written by Davey Wreden, is capable of having just as much impact on one's outlook on the Stanley Parable as the game itself is. Likewise, I would even argue, on a more subtle level, the 2013 version of the Stanley Parable is still a valuable piece of media. There are changes across the versions, both drastic and minor, that can convey entirely different meanings to the player. Despite this, Ultra Deluxe ultimately serves as an expansion to the underlying themes of the game, both in a jokey crows styled manner and also in a direct, structured narrative approach. The style in which the humor is displayed here has clearly developed and been influenced over the 9-year time gap, but some of this content still perfectly blends into the original game style, a feat that took both a technological and philosophical approach. The audio team focused on having Kevin Brighting's narration sound identical to their 2013 counterparts.
This mind control facility, it was too horrible to believe. It couldn't be true. Had Stanley really been under someone's control all this time? Was the bucket under the mind control facility's influence as well? Had the bucket been told to do things it didn't wish to do? What kinds of things does a bucket want to do or not want to do in the first place? These questions raced furiously in Stanley's feeble mind.
And the development team went into the project with the idea to keep the new content as grounded to the original style as possible, discounting the enormous gag that is the Stanley Parable 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., etc. The changes between the two titles vary in terms of overall map feel, jokes that were removed, an ending entirely revamped like the Red Door featuring entirely new games, endings that are no longer achievable, and many other minute details. There are examples of jokes being censored, content being removed, maps being changed out, and new endings were placed in additional branching paths. The biggest change of which being the introduction of the comical bucket that recontextualizes the entire game. Some of the bucket endings are merely new dialogue placed over already existing events, and others are entirely new sequences that serve to create a whole new experience. It can be argued that the lighter tone of the bucket content intrudes and devalues the original feel of the endings present in the 2013 version, but many of those endings are still perfectly intact. It's also not an issue that the writing is cheaper than the original, as some of the Ultra Deluxe content is the funniest that Davey Wreden has ever written.
Stanley? Stanley! Oh good, you're awake.
But there's a fine line being tiptoed and cracking jokes at lazy sequels and re-releases, while also trying to avoid the scrutiny of being a simple re-release. Though its marketing, even admitted by the developers, has been sold short.
We were debating in the trailer whether or not to put an hour of new content. That was what we were thinking. We thought it would be...
in the trailer?
We thought it was going to have an hour of new content. Or I suspected it was going to have an hour of new content. And we ultimately decided not to because we were concerned we weren't going to hit an hour of new content and then it would look like misleading advertising.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I'm glad we didn't put an hour of new content because it actually undersells how much content is in the final thing.
Yeah.
The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe features a whole host of new content. The new content is a far cry from what the game originally saw back in 2013, however, and can lead players to feel like this game is, indeed, a cash grab. The bucket content is just as capable of molding player impressions as the original. People who play this title today without playing the original version are going to come away from this experience with a much different outlook than players who first played the 2013 version. As media develops and blossoms over time, it's easy to find oneself alienated from overarching changes to the media's underlying themes, mechanics, or even just appeal. The Stanley Parable jokingly references this in a fake media post regarding the future of the franchise. Quote, "The press release goes on to promise to preserve the integrity of the original game." And even later on, the officially dubbed settings character argues that the Stanley Parable is not sacred. We do not need to protect it. Screw the legacy. There's an undertone here that seems to seep beneath far more than just the narrator's vision of the game. "Don't make his mistake. Don't cling to the legacy. Let it burn," is a quote that comes off as extremely direct. However, a disclaimer is needed before we can go any further. This is an analytical piece on the development of the Stanley Parable over a decade, and a lot has happened both within the game and also with the game's developer. This video dances around a fine line of making logical connections and trying to break down the more nuanced opinions and worldviews of Davey Wreden. This is, first and foremost, an essay for me, the author. My opinions and takeaways from Wreden's work are not to say anything directly about the game's author. Rather, it's for me to identify and understand his work that I have come to appreciate over a decade. Understand that I am fully aware of the concept of death of the author, and that this video only stretches beyond that boundary to form a deep takeaway for myself. Whether or not you identify with that is ultimately to your discretion. That being said, in many ways it appears as if the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is Davey Wreden's way of overcoming his mixed feelings regarding the game's success. Wreden has had an ongoing battle of depression following the commercial success of the Stanley Parable. He's written and been quoted about how he feels the original message of the game has been lost to him. In an interview with Adam Sessler, when asked about what the game's message is, William Pugh and Wreden say,
"But it's been out and we've played it so many times and seen so many other people play it, I don't think we can really see anything in the game anymore."
I have certainly had to try to disengage from it and get back to what I actually do feel about the game and what I actually do believe, like before all of that, you know.
On the original development website for the Stanley Parable, galacticcafe.com, Wreden wrote about his struggles for validation and his drive for constant, ever-so-feeding validation. He wrote about how the Game Awards were simply validation that his work was good. He was doing the right thing. However, Wreden struggled to identify with this validation. Quote, "The reality is that being given an award for your art is like being given the sun. No matter how you dress it up, the gift is ultimately intangible, distant. Trying to hold on to it will kill you." After the 2013 release of the Stanley Parable, his later title, The Beginner's Guide, would make its way to the PC market. This time around, the humor was set aside for a more serious tone. The Beginner's Guide explored the ideas of depression, seeking validation for one's efforts, invading the passions and privacy of those who you look up to, and plenty more. Wreden would also talk at Aalto University a year after the title's release to discuss the very concept of the underlying purpose of our creative efforts. The talk directly interweaves quotes and ideas that are expressed within the game, which makes it fairly clear that the Beginner's Guide is a direct exploration of Davey's depression, or at least the core values he's taken from it.
Robin and I were best friends for over a year before this. We live and work together. He did the sound design on Stanley Parable. He was and is one of the closest people in my life. He pulled me aside one day and sat me down and told me that when he was around me, when I was in the same room, that it made him feel physically ill. And that's when I realized, for the very first time, what a shitbag I was being.
What does that mean?
Then we come to the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, a game that finds it appropriate to reminisce and memorialize the game's past. Furthermore, it understands that the new content is going to shape the experience and takeaway that players can experience. The narrator even goes as far as saying,
"The game was perfect. It didn't need anything else. It didn't need new content. It just needed to be left alone, to spend the rest of time collecting dust in the hallowed hall of beloved video game memories."
However, returning to the end of the game, the settings character makes a final return to speak about how the legacy of the Stanley Parable isn't important. Quote, "And if people hate it, who cares? You see, that was the narrator's problem. He was so obsessed with what people thought of his work." It's incredibly easy to draw comparisons to the ideas expressed in the Stanley Parable to Davey Wreden's other public media. For example, both the epilogue of Ultra Deluxe and the Beginner's Guide have the player moving through buildings flooded with sand. There's a load of different ways to say that it feels like Wreden is coming to terms, in some capacity, with how the Stanley Parable has impacted his life. And his battle for depression isn't over, as indicated on his Twitter shortly after the game's release. The Stanley Parable, and furthermore Wreden's viewpoint on depression, is important enough to him to dedicate an entire game to the idea. Following Davey Wreden for the past decade has come to this point, a fictional character on a screen alluding to a legacy that must be left behind, a legacy that, so far, has been untarnished, a 100% hit rate. Creativity is stifled in the face of seeking validation for one's work. Perhaps some people find validation to be an ample motivator to continue working towards one's goals, but for others it is the creative wall, the writer's block. Developing video games takes a lot of time, but only in 2021 did the public hear about Davey Wreden's next project, because how do you top the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide? This is all hearsay until a definitive account is given from Wreden, but it's safe to assume that his struggles with mental health have gotten in the way of his creative endeavors. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is a valuable piece of media and an interesting case study in the numerous developments and changes that happen to an idea over time. Furthermore, looking past the media itself and seeing its surrounding climate can provide a lot of context to the decisions and motivations that went into the final product. Video games are very complex, with hundreds if not thousands of decisions going into just about every part of the process. Even the smallest of challenges outside of the game design process can have drastic ramifications of where the game will end up. The initial idea for a console port of the Stanley Parable was shelved because of the technical difficulties that came from working on the source engine.
You know, the question came up because it was only on PC.
Yeah.
Right? And so the question came up, is it possible to put this onto other consoles? I was like, all right, I don't want anything to do with this. And William was like, hey, you know, I'll poke around at it. And our programmer looked at it too. And basically after a while, the decision was made that porting from source is not going to be a good idea.
The fact that Ultra Deluxe came out at all speaks volumes to how passionate about the product Pew, Wreden, and the rest of the Crows team must have been. Thank you for watching.